Sure.
Okay, thank you.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm disappointed that I'm not getting to see you all in DC in person this year, but it's pretty cool that we can use technology and get this next best thing in. So today we're going to talk about the environmental impacts of the cannabis industry and how a few different states are handling the response to this new emerging industry. When I say cannabis, I mean both marijuana and hemp. We have both legalized here in Colorado. So first off, I'm just gonna, like I said, I'm gonna breeze through and kind of be brief to give the other speakers time to talk, but feel free to ask questions within the chat box. I might not be able to respond to them as I'm speaking, but once I'm done, I'll go back and check and respond to questions. You guys are also welcome to email me as well as my peers. So talking about the environmental impacts of cannabis cultivation. Here in Colorado, marijuana was mostly grown indoors because of our regulatory structure versus hemp is mostly grown outdoors. So for the marijuana industry, with it being an indoor industry, a lot of it's done in warehouses. So there's a lot of energy use for lighting and HVAC systems. There's other emissions from generators in rural areas, fuel burning activities. Some of them use them just as backup power, but there are a few remote cultivations that will use that as their sole source of power, which can be an issue. And it also gets fuzzy with enforcement there, whether or not your state has adopted the federal NSPS rules surrounding engines or not, because EPA will not enforce on a marijuana business because they see them as not a legal entity. So anyways, there's also usually water treatment that's involved for the influent water before it's fed to the plants. And then there's irrigation, there's runoff in an outdoor cultivation, or that becomes the wastewater effluent in an indoor cultivation. Outdoor, you're also dealing with erosion. There's a lot of plant waste, universal waste, and hazardous waste that comes out of the production process of marijuana. There's also air emissions, terpenes, which are responsible for the strong traditional marijuana odor, are volatile organic compounds, and volatile organic compounds are important for ozone formation. I'll talk more about trying to quantify that in the study and the work that Colorado is doing around those VOCs from cannabis. There's also quite a bit of chemical use. There's pesticides in the indoor cultivation and fertilizers. There's also a lot of solvents used for cleaning and also processing of the plants. So that brings me to the processing of marijuana and hemp. Hemp is also processed in a similar fashion to make CBD concentrates. So anything that's going to be at a marijuana dispensary that's not a flower and looks like flower or plant material goes through an extraction process. Some of them are solventless. A lot of them use solvent. It depends on what the end product is. But even though it's done in a closed loop system typically, so if you can see those cylinders there in the picture, those get loaded with plant material, they get shut, and then they get pressurized, and the solvent, the gas, usually a propane butane mix is most common. Ethanol is also used, isopropyl alcohol, heptane and pentane rarely used, sometimes hexane, but again it's pretty rare. For the most part, it's propane and butane in that extraction process, and those VOCs, do have evaporative losses throughout the process. There's also, CO2 is used as a solvent too, and so there can be some CO2 releases from that pressurized system. And then any cleaning products that go into cleaning these materials. Both hemp and marijuana cannabis plant is a very resinous plant. It has almost like sap, like tree sap. It's got a very sticky property to it, and it sticks to everything. And so it's very common in the industry to use a lot of isopropyl alcohol for cleaning purposes, which again, that's a VOC. There's also can be hazardous waste, the spent solvents from solvent extraction, and making sure that those are being handled properly as well. And then there's going to be the plant waste at the end of the cycle that needs to be disposed of as well. So With that, I wanted to point out that next month, the National Cannabis Industry Association will be releasing an environmental sustainability white paper. I project managed this effort, but it had about 20 to 30 experts from across the country working on writing this paper since November. It's pretty extensive. I think the total page count was about 100 pages. It covers environmental impacts, best management practices, and policy considerations for the cannabis industry, both hemp and marijuana. Got a chapter on energy, air, water, waste, land use, and soil health. So a pretty extensive paper. I think it'll be a really good resource for all of you folks once that's published. I'll make sure to share it with the national network once it's available, but that will be coming out from, like I said, NCIA. And really the goal for it was to help influence, environmentalism within the cannabis industry and position it to be an environmental leader as an agricultural commodity. There's a lot of opportunity to do things sustainability in a sustainable way that isn't necessarily required by regulation. And so that was the point of this paper. I'm really excited for it to come out next month. So as I mentioned, VOCs. So as the cannabis plant grows, it emits terpenes, and terpenes are volatile organic compounds. The most common types of compounds that we saw in sampling were myrcene, limonene, pinene, and terpinolene. So, these terpenes are not unique to just cannabis. It's just the combination of them are unique to cannabis. So, for instance, limonene comes from lemons, pinene is pine trees. These are not unique VOCs, but there is a heightened importance in looking at the VOCs from marijuana cultivation here in Colorado, with the way that we legalized, and that we forced almost all cultivation to be done indoors within, industrial zoned areas, which happen to be, the heart of our city centers, right in our Knox-rich areas, at the intersections of our major highways, right downtown, right in the industrial zoned area. And so in that Knox-rich environment, any new sources of VOC concentration will readily form ozone. And so with this new influx of marijuana cultivation in Colorado, we really want to figure out what is the VOC contribution to our overall ozone equation. And so that brings me to the next slide. You guys all know how ozone is formed, but just to remind you, it's when nitrogen oxide, which comes from combustion sources, reacts with volatile organic compounds in the presence of sunlight to form that ground level ozone. And so the cannabis industry contributes VOCs from the plants as they grow, like I said, and then also from the product processing, those evaporative losses from the solvents that they use. So it's important to point out that marijuana cultivation is considered an agricultural activity even when grown indoors, and agricultural activities are exempt from air quality regulations. So Colorado is, I'm leading up project managing a study right now to quantify the VOC emission rate of the plants. So how many pounds of VOCs are emitted per pound of marijuana grown. However, once we do get that answer, we're going to use it to model the ozone impacts. But at the end of the day, these cannabis cultivations are exempt from air quality regulations. However, the processing is not. So again, the solvents evaporate during extraction and cleaning. That also contributes to VOCs, but this is a point of compliance. This is considered a manufacturing process. This is where you're taking the agricultural commodity and manufacturing it into something else. So we need to account for those air emissions. We do permit these facilities both for the marijuana industry and for the hemp extraction industry. Happy to share example permits and APINs from Colorado to help your guys' air programs get started. I worked with a lot of the states that have legalized marijuana already on this, but for those that have hemp facilities and aren't sure how to permit them, Colorado is willing to share our permits and give you access to our permitted engineers and answer questions. But at the end of the day, very basic equation, mass balance equation for calculating emissions, very similar to what we do for auto body paint shops. How much solvent was purchased this year minus what's currently within your inventory. You know, you might be able to subtract out what's captured within your hazardous waste stream and gets picked up through that, but we require testing to see, you know, what percentage is of that hazardous waste is actually VOCs. And then we assume that everything else evaporates, and that's what we write the permits on. And again, similar permit requirements for a closed loop extraction solvent use facility. And again, that processing with solvents is subject to air quality regulations. So as I mentioned, we're doing at CDPHE, we're doing an air quality sampling study. We got $31,000 to conduct the study. We sampled at 4 commercial cannabis cultivation facilities, and samples were collected throughout the plant life cycle. So within the clone phase, that's when they're just little baby plants. Within the vegetative phase, that's where we're receiving 24-hour or 18 hours of sunlight, more sunlight than not, 18 to 24 hours of sunlight. And then in the flower rooms, those are the mature plants where you're actually getting buds, and that process is triggered by 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness. We also collected samples throughout the harvesting and trimming activities, and at facilities that had carbon filtration, we did collect pre and post filtration results at exhaust points. However, some of those won't be able to be quantifiable in the study because we actually, hold on, I apologize. I had a package delivered. I'm sorry, my dog. Anyways, so at those facilities where we took post carbon filtration results, at a couple of them, we actually saw higher VOC emissions post carbon filtration than pre carbon filtration. And again, that's because these facilities are in industrial zone facilities, and we were actually capturing VOCs that weren't from the cultivation facilities and were from, you know, other industrial sources nearby. So that was, you know, taken into account as well. Study results were supposed to come out this summer, but they have been, due to the COVID response, we've had a delay in our ozone modeling, and now our results won't be published till this fall, but I'm pretty confident that we'll be able to publish October, November. We'll get those ozone modeling results about mid-August. I'm hopeful for that. One trend to point out from this study is that terpenes increase as the plant grows. VOC emissions increase with the process. So, you know, very little VOC emissions in the clone stage, increasing throughout the flowering stage. That makes sense. You can smell them. Increasing emissions in the drying and curing process. Again, as the plants dry, they're releasing more of those VOCs. And then it actually increases in the trimming process and the harvesting process. As you agitate that plant material, it releases more of the VOCs. And then, you know, through processing, processing emissions are going to increase because not only do you have the plant material VOCs, but then you also have the VOCs from the solvent extraction. All right, so I apologize that I'm going quickly, but I'm trying to stick to 20 minutes to give the other speakers plenty of time. But I do want to point out that controlling best management practices for controlling odors may also control VOC emissions. In the case of carbon filtration, that is the case. What the carbon filter is actually, you know, capturing those VOC emissions so they're not causing an odor, and then those VOCs are no longer able to react for ozone purposes. However, in the cannabis industry, there are other odor control practices that increase VOC emissions. Basically, with masking agents and counteractive agents, you're just blowing out, you know, stronger smelling VOCs, of pine smell instead of a marijuana smell. With counteractive agents, it's just a trick of the nose. 2 complementary smells enter the olfactory senses. They cancel each other out, but if you were to actually do a speciated VOC sampling, you would see the marijuana terpenes, and you would see the counteractive agent terpenes as well. And so just be wary of chemical odor controls, and know if they're actually truly neutralizing. There's very few out there that truly neutralize the cannabis odor. However, though, if they're neutralizing agents, they're most likely oxidants, and then that poses threat to both plants and people. And so, you know, for instance, there's one out there that uses iodine, but iodine's an oxidant, and so you're exposing plants and people to an oxidant. Just be mindful of that. All right, so then I'm going to talk about the CO2 capture and reuse project, a highlight of something that, you know, through the Colorado SBAP program that I helped lead and project manage. This was a really exciting project for me because it brought together two of the industries of focus that I've worked on. You know, previously in 2017, I did a large effort with the craft brewing industry and you know, shared those resources with the national network. And now that I've moved on to cannabis, it was really exciting to be able to circle back and bring these two industries together with this CO2 capture and reuse project. And essentially what we're doing is, in the last stage of the brewing process, that's fermentation, that's where the yeasts are eating the sugars. Through that process, you create alcohol, but you also create CO2, and a lot of CO2. You have to vent the CO2 out of the brewing tanks, because if you didn't, they would explode. It'd be too much pressure, too much CO2. And so they vent that CO2 typically, you know, just to atmosphere. And then, you know, in the packaging line, they add CO2 back in to recarbonate the beer. And so in steps Earthly Labs that has some pretty innovative capture equipment in that center picture there, where underneath where it says compress. We put that device at the brewery. It is able to capture those CO2 emissions coming off of the fermentation tanks, clean them, scrub them, dry them, compress them, liquefy them, and then put them in that tank that's also in that center picture there as liquid CO2. And then the brewery can become its own CO2 supplier to recarbonate the beer. And then at the marijuana cultivation, it's very common for indoor marijuana cultivations to inject CO2 into the flowering rooms to supplement plant growth. And the reason why you need that supplemental CO2 within a grow environment is you're condensing the lifespan of the plant from, you know, a 6 to 9 month grow cycle outside to maybe 2 to 4 months inside, depending on growing method and, you know, cultivator. They do things a little bit differently. But you're compressing that life cycle, and for that plant to optimally perform as if it were an outdoor plant and, you know, complete its full life cycle and grow its biggest flowers and the best product possible, it needs all the same inputs for that life cycle, all the same nutrients. That's why we force feed it nutrients through the irrigation system. It needs the same amount of sunlight. That's why it has really intense, you know, bright lights. And then with that bright light, you know, it needs supplemental CO2 because CO2 is part of that photosynthesis process that the plant needs to convert that carbon to energy and then breathe out the oxygen. And so with this project, the brewery became its own CO2 supplier, but the brewery only actually needs, depending on brewery size, I'd say like 10 to 20% of the CO2 that they produce. And they would just vent the rest, even with this technology. And so we brought the two industries together to form a partnership. And so the cultivation will purchase the excess CO2 from the brewery and use it as an input into their process. Where some of the sustainable benefits came in with this is, you know, we're using a CO2 stream that would just be vented as a waste as an input to, you know, another process. The plants sequester the carbon and use it. And so it's, you know, it's all around beneficial, but it was also economically beneficial. The cultivation saved about $1,000 a month, even just within this pilot phase where they're only feeding two cultivation rooms. Once they have data, they'll expand the rest of the cultivation. But it saves them a lot of money, and it also takes vehicle miles off the road from trucking, you know, CO2 from a power plant as a byproduct of power generation and putting it on a truck and you know, driving it all over the city and doing multiple deliveries. The brewery and the cultivation are only about 6 miles away from each other, and they do deliveries about once a week. And so it's pretty sustainable overall. Really excited about this project. It was in the news a lot. If you want to find out more details, you can Google it. Lots will come up. So let's look at time. All right, I'm over time. I'm right at 12:20, but I'm going to take a couple more minutes to go over some regulatory structure, and then I'll pass it off to our next presenters. So just wanted to point out some regulatory lessons from Colorado related to cannabis. So all of our marijuana waste is required to be mixed with 50% non-marijuana waste before it can leave a licensed facility. And that's so that people aren't recovering that trash and diverting it to the black market and using it as a commodity. But that also doubles our landfill footprint and makes composting very difficult because you have to come up with 50% organic waste stream, and then composters charge per pound of pickup. It can be difficult. So we do have a fiber recovery exemption from that 50-50 mixing rule just for stalks and stems. So stalks and stems have low THC value in them and a really high fiber value to them. And so if they're going to be recycled for industrial fiber purposes, they don't have to be mixed with 50-50. That was a good efficiency that we kind of learned from our mistakes. Also, we now allow for, as of January, take back programs for recycling packaging and vape waste at dispensaries. So a customer that purchases marijuana from a dispensary and gets a couple layers of packaging and it's all small, hard to recycle, one-use plastics, they can now bring that back to the facility to either be bulk recycled or it can be, sanitized and reused. There's a couple, extra steps for that to maintain childproof integrity, but we're hoping for a little bit better recycling and reuse with take back programs at the facility, because both of those waste streams are pretty hard to recycle in single stream recycling. We're also allowing for traditional e-waste recyclers to accept vape cartridges and vape waste that have trace amounts of marijuana still within them. They don't have to have a special marijuana license. The intent is recycling. They can process them as regular e-waste. That's a big efficiency that we now allow for, because before it was really hard to get somebody to recycle vape waste because they had to have a special marijuana license to do it. And there wasn't just a big enough waste stream, and there was multi-barriers. So now traditional e-waste recyclers can take that vape waste, even if it has trace amounts of product in it. We now allow for irrigation of hemp with reclaimed water, so lower grade than drinking water. We don't allow it for marijuana because, again, marijuana is typically grown indoors, and there was some issues with aerosolizing bacteria and viruses that we actually need it to be treated to that drinking water standard with an indoor environment, but that's still up for debate. And then also we now allow better access to composting by allowing a 50-50 mix to take place within the composting truck. So picture, it's got to be under surveillance and lock and key and some other regulatory caveats, but basically the composting truck can roll up to a dumpster full of plant waste, only plant waste, pick it up by putting it in the back of the truck. That is the 50-50 mix point of compliance. And so they don't have to come up with that 50% organic waste stream. However, that's a great rule, except for really large cultivators. They're coming up with like a roll-off dumpster full of plant waste every day. This isn't going to work for them. So it is kind of size restrictive. I've got best practices up for air quality, energy, water, and waste. I'm not going to go through them with you guys today just for the sake of time. But if there's any questions about them, I kind of put the highlights up on the slides, and so you guys will have the slides. But I do want to mention that all of these best management practices will be included in the NCI white paper that is set to come out next month, about mid-June. Is when they expect to publish and release that. So that'll be a really good resource for you guys, and I'll make sure to share that with you. Also worth mentioning that Colorado is working on a free online benchmarking tool for the cannabis industry to track and trend environmental metrics in a secure and anonymous way. This was modeled after what the Brewers Association has done, where brewers or cultivators can, log on to a system, report how much energy they use, water, how much waste is generated versus how much product did they produce. They can track their trends over time. They can put in, if they've got return on investment projects like upgrading lights or something, they can track their return on investment time periods. Pretty interesting tool that we're working on building. That's the address there, the link for it. It's still in process because what we found is cannabis businesses aren't real quick to share their data, even if we don't have access to it. We went through a third-party vendor to build the site so that it is not our product. We don't actually have access to the back-end information unless we set it up in very specific ways. But again, if anyone who's interested, we can talk about it. There is the ability to do like state reporting back to the state if that's something that your program is interested in. I just mention it because if you're thinking that there's a similar need, don't reinvent the wheel. We've got something going and you're welcome to jump in on it and add your state's flavor to it. We just hope it's a national system that gets used. And that's it for me. So I will check the chat box for any questions. I'll let Mark decide if he wants me to take a few questions now or wait till the end.
So anyways, this is Donovan. I would say let's go ahead and address a couple of the questions that came up
Okay.
in general. That way we don't like lose them and confuse them.
Sure.
First one I had is, when you're working on looking at the emissions, did you look at any potential emission factors related to the drying operations? Here in Tennessee, we did have a couple of complaints about a drying operation using effectively an industrial dryer designed specifically for hemp in this case.
Yeah. So we did take samples in the drying rooms for the drying process, and we will be able to, give those results, and those could lead into a drying emission factor. But it's going to be for marijuana, and I mean, hemp and marijuana are essentially the same plant, but that is a question for Colorado as well. Right now, we are not regulating hemp dryers. We probably should be. We just don't have an emission factor for it. So, if another state requires testing and comes up with a hemp emission factor, I encourage sharing that because we just don't have one now. It has come up that we could use like drying factors from like grain elevators or, existing AP42 emission factors, except for, hemp is going to be pretty different. Just like every different type of wood is different in the wood drying emission factors, like it's oak versus, something else, it has different emission factors. So that is something that needs to be looked into. And here in Colorado, where the regulations break down, is we consider it an agricultural process until it leaves the field. And so if you're drying in the fields, which a lot of agricultural crops are done that way, then we don't consider that permittable. That's part of the agricultural process, but it turns into manufacturing as soon as you bring it indoors, take it off of the field and put it inside, even if that's just in a barn with a dryer. We do consider that part of the manufacturing process, and those emissions would be regulated. We just don't have an emission factor yet.
Yeah, very, very correct. Yeah, ours was mainly stemming from a complaint. So we were looking at that, and as you remember, we were looking at the grain drying. Linnell is suggesting potentially there's an alfalfa drying AP42. That would at least be closer in terms of it being a plant material, but of course with the slate of terpenes present in cannabis in general, with there being only minor differences between marijuana and industrial hemp in terms of the overall terpenes, except in certain cases like the THC, then they should be fairly similar.
I mean, we could get you could probably easily get a total VOC reading from a PID meter. We used PID meters in our study. The handheld device, most of our agencies probably have one, in like technical services is who has ours. But we just we calibrated it to isobutylene because it's similar, matches like our dominant terpene profile, and then you can get a total VOC number. Or the other option is to collect speciated results, like with a 10X tube, mail them off to, I recommend Desert Research Institute because they seem to be the only one that has the established method for aerosolized cannabis terpenes. and you know, one of those samples is about $650, but you could require the facility to take those speciated, you know, 2 or 3 of those speciated samples and get a pretty good idea of the emissions profile, and then that would probably set national precedents for an emission factor until EPA or somebody else establishes one.
Okay. The next question is composting on site an option?
Composting on site is an option. It's pretty rare though, because again, with these marijuana facilities grown indoors and then being zoned industrial, every square foot of that facility is pretty expensive. And so you typically want to dedicate as much, you know, square footage to cultivation and processing, kind of, you know, what makes them money, versus having space inside for indoor composting. And it's pretty hard to do composting, get a composting license outside because these indoor facilities and where they're located. So there is a challenge with that. However, with the smaller cultivators, we are seeing bokashi fermentation used quite a bit, and that's like done in like 55-gallon drums, and that's basically just an accelerated version of composting that can easily be done indoors. But like I said, once you get up to these really large facilities that have like a roll-off some sort of plant waste a day, like 500 to 1,000 pounds, it's not a possibility. But for the smaller cultivators, yes. And for outdoor cultivation, definitely could be, on-site composting could be more of an option if they have the space for it.
All right, and final question for right now. On that white paper, do you think it'll include any estimates of emissions, particularly the VOCs?
It will not. I was hoping that it would, because my VOC results were supposed to be coming out this summer, but they were delayed the modeling was delayed due to COVID. And so it will not include that. However, that document is set to be updated either annually or semi-annually. I don't know if that's been decided yet. It might be determinant on how much new information comes out if they decide to do an updating round next year. I will kind of anecdotally share with this group. I can't share, you know, values and results yet until they're published through that scientific, you know, peer review process, which is kind of a pain. But you know, even our largest facilities, like really large facilities here in Colorado that have a lot of plants, like maybe 50,000 plants at any one point in time, even those big facilities, we're not exceeding our APEN thresholds for VOC emissions on an annual basis. However, it's important to look at the reactivity of those VOCs on our ozone influence, because although the amount of VOCs are pretty low from these facilities, they're highly reactive for ozone formation. And so we really can't say what the influence is on ozone formation from that, you know, relatively low concentration of VOCs until we get those modeling results. And then it, you know, it kind of brings in the question too of facility by facility, the VOC emissions may be low, but in Colorado, it's our licensing structure changed a little bit, so the number's a little fuzzy, but it's about 60 to 70% of cultivation is done within our ozone non-attainment area of the state. And so, you know, puts a heightened interest on these emissions, but we are seeing really low VOC concentrations for a high olfactory response. So for instance, our odor ordinance at the state level is based on a 7-to-1 ratio through a nasal ranger, which basically puts 7 parts of air through a carbon filter to 1 part of contaminated air. Can your olfactory senses smell it or not? We're not seeing marijuana odor violations that commonly through that device at that 7-to-1 ratio. And after doing the study, it makes sense, because even though there's a high olfactory response to the terpenes that are there, they're in very low concentrations, so that they can easily be captured when you put 7 parts through a carbon filter. I guess what I'm getting at.
Okay. Thank you for that, Kaylin. You want to hand it over?
Sure.
Okay. So as Caitlin, of course, with Colorado, they've been doing the majority of a lot of the work that a lot of our other states have been basing off of, including here in Tennessee. Recently in Tennessee, we've been doing a lot more with agribusiness and working with them. In fact, we have been called up by our economic community development to do a lot of work with meat slaughterhouses on a small scale recently, as of course, one of the big issues has been that some of the larger supply chain is having issues, but perhaps the smaller local slaughterhouses are seeing upticks of up to 100 or maybe even 200% of business increase. But Daniel's been doing a lot of that. Well, but anyway, so we developed an agribusiness page, and if at any time it doesn't carry through, let me know. So we had a couple of resources, sawmills, lumber yards, and we're looking at most commonly asked questions. And of course, hemp and CBD oil extraction is one of the more common ones that we've been seeing, and especially as we've been talking about, this is a emerging industry. So trying to provide information up ahead of time so that people are aware of it as they start developing their business plan, other than in the back end, it's like, hey, I've been doing this for a few years and now you tell me there's regulations. So to that end, I developed this web page here, and in Tennessee, we only allow industrial hemp. We do not allow marijuana still, that it's still considered illegal. So the definition, I did go over a little bit. In our definition, industrial hemp is that containing a 0.3% or less of THC content. Marijuana is still hemp, it's all cannabis, but there have to be a few definitions thrown out there to try to distinguish between the two different varieties there. This actually is a test field at Agricultural International in Memphis, where they've been testing different varieties to see which ones grow best in Tennessee. They found about 3 different varieties. Of course, as they told me, their methodology was a bit loose in that they picked about 6 varieties that had names that sounded like they would grow well in the South and started trying to grow those. They found 1 or 2 that worked out very well and some that did not work very well. But as Caitlin said, agriculture is not something we really regulate. That's all in the Department of Agriculture. It is regulated fairly strongly here in the state of Tennessee, where you have to register with the Department of Agriculture to even start growing. One of the things that we have been finding out from the Department of Agriculture is there are probably 300 to 400 growers, and I want to say about 30,000 acres, and that was in the first year or so. But this is also an industry that is increasing by 100 to even 300% per year. So as people get into it, and one of the particular points we've been finding is there are more growers than there are places to process it. And of course, processing is where us as environmental groups would be able to more step into a degree, because that's where they start getting environmental regulations. To this end, I have a little bit about each of them, mainly on air, water, waste, and those being the 3 primary areas that would impact a processor. And a guidance was developed for that. Hopefully this carries through. Let me know if it doesn't. That essentially walks a potential facility through what their potential requirements might be. These would be, I gave definitions there, but essentially talk about the air permitting side of it and walk them through what the Tennessee air permits are, as well as what your broad categories are, and explain the potential for mass balance, as well as if there are emission factors developed, how you go about using them. Right now, we're looking at mainly insignificant sources to true minor sources. In Tennessee, if you do not have the potential to emit 5 tons or more of a criteria pollutant or 1,000 pounds of any hazardous air pollutant in a year, then you're considered an insignificant source, and you don't actually have to have a permit, but you have to go through all the steps as if you were asking for a permit in order for us to make that determination. so I talk about how you actually go through all these calculations and give at least as detailed as I can, step-by-step calculation process. However, more than likely, the other will be looking more at the waste because, as Caitlin mentioned, potentially there's a chance for hazardous waste because if they're not doing a good extraction, then they could potentially have a flammable waste that would classify as a hazardous waste and it has to be treated as such. Something I did receive from our solid waste management group is if the plant material is returned to the farm that grew it to be used as a soil amendment or such, then they won't require any permitting. Otherwise, they may have to treat it as a special waste because it may be considered a bulky or a little bit hazardous to deal with, but it's not an actual hazardous waste. So I talked about each of those. Now, one of the things that also Caitlin had mentioned to me early back on is there may be water issues. Of course, construction, stormwater, standard one. If you're in a location that might impact a wetland or such, then you might need an ARAP. But after that, she did notice that there were a few publicly owned treatment works that might have asked for pre-treatment or grease trap because the CBD oil is very viscous. It's about the same consistency of molasses. Whether or not you leave it out in the cold, that's another option, but it is a pretty viscous and very sticky liquid, and it has several very similar properties to the grease that might be trapped in a grease trap. So depending on the capability of the publicly owned treatment work, they may ask for something about that ahead of time. Of course, one of the other concerns that the water may have is how much THC is coming into their water supply. Because even though industrial hemp has to have a 0.3% or less in the plant, as you're processing it, that is going to concentrate at least some. And especially if you're doing, there's three main groups for CBD oil. That's your full spectrum, your broad spectrum, and your isolate. Your full spectrum is pretty much you do one run of extraction and everything is left in it. Your broad spectrum, you do a little bit of extra extraction to pull out some of the different terpenes, especially potentially THC. And then your isolate is focusing very solidly on just certain aspects of that. So this sort of explains to the facility what that might happen. And there's a lot of what ifs to try and cover all the bases. So that's why I'm just sort of scrolling through this. It's like, this goes into a lot of details, but it is designed to help out the facility look and ask themselves these questions. What am I going to be doing? What type of solvent am I going to be using? What issues will I eventually have to fix? So that way, it's just sort of a general guidance. It's not considered a regulatory guidance. And then, of course, I have a lot of references at the very end, which includes a really great paper that Colorado, which Caitlin had impact on. This is the Cannabis Environmental Best Management Practices Guide put out by the Denver, because as Caitlin said, a lot of Colorado is focused on marijuana, which is indoor grown. So Denver in particularly has a lot of facilities growing marijuana, but it also has good general information for all growers of hemp as well as processors. So that's a little bit of the general overview that's going on here in Tennessee as far as hemp and cannabis. So I think I saw a few questions pop up. Let's see if I can get to those. All right.
I responded to Jeremy on the one he was asking about, you know, how do you talk to this industry, basically. That's one of the things I'm going to definitely cover in a minute, Jeremy. So I just, or Donman, I had just responded back to him. So I think that that was the only one.
And I can jump in on that one too. I had a little bit in the chat, but how to become, make inroads with this industry. I would just say, similar to any small business sector, is gain their trust and become a good resource for them. Help them out, make things easy on them. Show that you're there to be helpful, and that you're not another regulator bombarding them, because this industry gets a lot of that. They're highly regulated and by so many different agencies. Approaching them as a new agency can be difficult, and they're kind of scared, deer in the headlights. So I'd say working with established stakeholder groups is where I made a lot of progress. I worked with the Denver Cannabis Sustainability Work Group that put out that best management practices guide. The first year I worked with them, I noticed that the guide didn't have an air chapter. So I wrote the air chapter for them, and just really gaining their trust. And then once they see you as a resource, I've seen a really good response from them. They just want help. They just want to understand. They want their questions answered, and us being a free and confidential resource where they can ask questions and not have to be scared about, upheaving underlying compliance issues with the regulatory agencies is really helpful.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I've gone to a couple of conferences that are focused on cannabis and hemp production that were put on by our Tennessee Agricultural Extension Agency. So if you can get connected with agriculture and find out about these, because agriculture is probably going to be your primary key source for regulation, especially on the grower side, but then the processors are going to want to connect with the farmers. And if agriculture is having a conference to talk about the regulations and you're able to show up there, then you can talk to both sides and start making inroads there. And also, if you develop something like this guidance here that I developed, use the cards that you pick up at those conferences to ask them, like, hey, does this make sense? Am I getting this correct? And send it to them for their review before you make it a finalized document. Get that stakeholder input.
Absolutely. They love the opportunity to get involved. I would say this industry, they've been misrepresented quite a bit. And even, us as our Colorado regulatory structure, a lot of the flaws in it, at least environmental flaws, just came from a misunderstanding and not understanding, the intricacies of the agencies and how they work. So anything you can do to learn from the cultivators as much as give them information back, I say is important. So just have open ears.
Yep. Anyways, so let me hand it over to Jenifer now.
All right, sorry about that. I'm not as used to Zoom as I am some of the other platforms. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about, first of all, I wanted to thank Caitlin. She has been an amazing partner for us here in Michigan. We have both marijuana and hemp that are legalized. And so just working with Colorado when we first started, when we knew that we were going to get legalization coming down, working with her and having her be such a great partner for us and being really willing to share resources. I hope we've helped her a little bit. I know our two main people in our air quality division that are working on our cannabis work group are helping with the white paper. So that's been really awesome for us as a state agency. But I just want to, because I have just 10 minutes, so I'm going to kind of fly through a couple things here just to kind of talk about some differences and maybe some similarities, and especially the whole communications piece with this information. So in Michigan, marijuana is considered industrial and commercial, and hemp is agricultural, and our agency doesn't do anything with agriculture. So most of our hemp is grown outside. Not all of our marijuana is grown inside. So that's an interesting thing. And I think for our environmental agency, it's been really kind of frustrating to figure out basically what rules do we already have in place that address this industry, and where do we need to go with that. So you've heard a lot of people kind of talk about that. Caitlin talked about it a little bit, maybe not in those specific terms, but definitely what the challenges are. So for us, sorry, I guess I should share this a little bit better. There we go. For us, we do have obviously some rules, but we don't have any specific environmental rules specifically dealing with hemp or marijuana. We always deal through our marijuana regulatory agency and which is our licensing and regulatory affairs. They basically hold all of the rules for the marijuana industry. With hemp, we have to deal with our Michigan Department of Agriculture and Rural Development. So it's complicated when you're sort of the ugly stepchild in all of this, but your rules are really important, and getting people to follow along and know what they're supposed to be doing is obviously also really important. So one of the main things that we were focused on, at least in the beginning, was cultivation and processing, which you've heard Donovan and Caitlin talk about. So I'm just gonna go past all of this. These are all, concerns brought up by our work group. What are we doing with all of this stuff? What should we be doing? Do we need different rules? How do our rules apply? So I'm just kind of scanning through that. The attainment issues, just like in Denver, it's a big deal for us too. A lot of our facilities are on the east side of the state where most of our non-attainment areas are. So that's also a big deal for us. So what were some of the things that we asked ourselves is, what chemicals are being used in these processes? And I know you guys talked a little bit about it, and it was kind of like, whoa, some of these things like heptane and things like that, you wouldn't even think of it. People typically, when they think about marijuana or hemp, are thinking like, well, this is a very like quote unquote green industry, and it isn't necessarily. If they're doing it right, it can be, but if they're not doing it right, which a lot of them weren't in the beginning, it maybe isn't necessarily. So what are their annual emissions from an air quality perspective? I mean, that obviously, and I don't want to be very punny, but it's obviously still up in the air, as you've heard everybody say, haha. So, but it really is. And that's the thing, is like, there's some of this that we know. And I had arguments with our field operations supervisor for air quality. Like, this is an industrial process. When we're talking about extracting oils and doing all that, it's an industrial process. We should regulate it, inspect it, just like we would any other industrial process. The other stuff is what we have to figure out. And then we had to figure out our air permitting, or could they use one of our permitting exemptions, similar to what Donovan said. When we're looking at some of the potential to emit for some of these, at least in the beginning, we thought, well, these could be Title V sources. So how do we deal with that? And in Michigan, because all of our air permits are pre-construction, and we realized we had a lot of facilities out there that were already operating with no permits, how did we want to handle that sort of enforcement discretion? And did we have the ability to use that? So these were some really big conversations we wanted to have. When you talk about building trust in a new industry, the first thing you don't want to do is go write them violation notices for something that they were likely ignorant of in the first place. We had a lot of issues around solid waste produced and disposed, because like Caitlin said, if they want to compost it, which most of them do, in Michigan, the rule says you have to have basically a guard standing there 24/7. Well, none of our composting facilities in the entire state have that. So how do we build that infrastructure after we already have the waste? And basically what had happened with that is that the regulatory agency hadn't talked to us about how we already regulate those facilities. So there's all these gaps in sort of our different state departments not talking to each other. And then wastewater, and for us a lot, I mostly work with air people, is who responds to the odor complaints? How do we run those through our operators? What questions do they need to ask the caller so that we can figure out, is it go back to the locals? Is it go to an inspector? Who is supposed to be dealing with this? So the first thing that we did, and this I just wanted to show you, we do have a pretty cool interactive map of all of our marijuana facilities. And this one is just, I pulled it from today, and I kind of just, opened everything up, and I didn't want to go there live because you know how some of these GIS maps can be a little bit overwhelming. But you can see that this concentration of sites down here in the Detroit area was a big deal. So another component of what we're dealing with in Michigan is part of the rules being promulgated was that there's a big social equity component. And what they wanted to do with that was to say, just because you don't have the $5 million to start a grow operation indoors, if you want to be part of this new industry, how can you get money? How can you do that kind of stuff? So the first thing we did is we formed a multimedia work group within our environmental agency. We figured building those relationships, one of the first things we wanted to do is we sat down and we wrote this very extensive communications plan, and we pretty much said, what resources do we think we need? What kind of training can we provide? Who should we talk to? Who can we get on board with us? Who's already doing things that we can ask them to speak for us, that we can give them materials to speak for us? So that's kind of what we did. We created all these bulletins with our licensing agency to share with licensees that would come in, and they share them from the get-go. So they basically say, like, here's a packet, like, hey, you probably don't know, you all also have these environmental responsibilities as well. So then we did a quick web page, which I'm going to show because I want to be cool like Donovan. So I don't know because I probably didn't share this right, so you won't be able to. There you go. To share this one, I think, screen. There we go.
Yeah, we're not seeing it. There you go.
There you go. I'm getting there, Donovan. Give me a chance here. I'm not Zoom capable. I have limited Zoom efficiency here. So this is our website. We used to house this in our regulatory agency, but they wanted to move it over to ours. So we did specific guidance for marijuana and specific guidance for hemp, because in Michigan, we look at them differently. And although they overlap a lot, they don't align perfectly. So one of the things I think is most interesting is if I'm a hemp grower and I'm growing industrial hemp, and we have the same thing that you do, Donovan, where, you know, the federal rules say it can only be this much THC. And if they test it and it's over that, they test the field and they assume the whole field is then over, and they have a couple more chances to test. But typically when hemp grows longer, it has more, not less. It's weird that it would have less. So in Michigan, they would have to take that whole field and dispose of it as marijuana. They can't reuse it. They can't sell it as something different. And so it's a very, like, one of those weird places in the regulations where things just don't quite line up. So we kind of did that. We did a checklist, I think is similar to what you did, Donovan, but it's like very condensed version. And we use that a lot just to say when we're going to give talks, here's an overview of what you might need to know, and here we are to answer your questions if you have them, because we want you to be prepared when you go forward with this. We just issued our first air permit on Friday, so that was like, yay, cool. But we get complaints all the time, and so just trying to figure out how we can deal with this and who can we talk to about it. So that was pretty cool as well. I won't go back to my presentation because it's not really a big deal, but one of the things I just wanted to focus on for Jeremy's sake is, just like Caitlin said, we have staff that are going to talk to anybody and their brother about this. Anything that we get invited to, we go to. Any conferences, some of them are a little sketchy, so I would be careful, but we definitely go talk at conferences. One of the most I think innovative ways we got the word out about this is we did this local leaders webinar series, and I know my Region 5 folks know what this is, but it was a webinar series that we did specifically to talk to local governments about issues that might be in their community or concerns that they might have about things in their community. And we did, our first one we did about PFAS, and the second one we did, it was marijuana, and we had over 600 people attend that. And, you know, you think about it, these local leaders are going to be your House representatives, and they're going to move up the chain. So it's a really good way to say, like, when you have these facilities coming in and you want them in because of the economic base, here's some resources that you can give them to make sure that they're in compliance from the get-go. And if you can go at people from all those different angles, I think you're going to have higher rates of compliance. They're going to be more trusting of the information that you give them. When you say we're the government, we're here to help, they might actually believe you, maybe a little bit. So I think that part is really, really important. And that's definitely one of the lessons that we've learned as we went through kind of communicating about, oh, you need extra energy and you want to put a power plant in the middle of a green space to grow hemp and then process it. You know, that might be a problem, and how can we deal with that? So I know it's 2:59, Donovan, so I'm going to stop talking because I know there's a bunch of questions.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. So yeah, like we've been saying, there's a lot of resources that are coming out there. There are more on the way. I know many of us have been eagerly awaiting Caitlin's emission factors, and that white paper that's coming out sounds like another really great resource. So definitely when that comes out, we're looking forward to that. And each state will approach it in a slightly different manner, but in general, looking at the processing side, for the most part, they're going to be small, minor sources. It's going to be fairly rare that you're going to have somebody that, even as Caitlin said, some of their larger processors that are processing multiple tons per day, unless they do something like, I remember she telling me about one that was looking at processing using hexane to begin with, and it had a potential emission of 50 tons per year of hexane, and she was able to step in and say, you don't really want to do that. So that's going to be the really rare case, but typically they're going to be small. The other thing is, a lot of people look at is a gold rush or a CBD rush as the new oil boom. However, growing it is an expensive proposition. I have been told that growing hemp, or especially marijuana, is as expensive as tobacco, which was one of the more costly crops out there, but it was purely a cash crop. So there'll be a lot on both sides, but getting that initial understanding that we are there to help. This is not the standard, like, run up the hollow, put a few plants in, and rig your tripwires like it used to be. It's not like that anymore. This is a legitimate business and should be treated as such. So any other questions?
With that, I'd just like to echo you, Donovan, in saying that, you know, to be able to help these businesses and do outreach with this business sector, you really do need to treat with them with the same professionalism that you would treat any other legitimate business. It's, you know, all giggling aside about marijuana and pot and all of that, they want to be seen as professionals. They want to be seen as compliant businesses, and they want to work with you as professionals as well. So, you know, personal biases aside about your feelings about the plant itself is important.
It doesn't help if we come in and say and treat them differently, because they already have so many strikes against them just from a public perspective. And we've seen that. I live in a very small town, and we have a funny quick story that the video, the old family video, was bought by a recreational store, and it shares a parking lot with Taco Bell. So when we're talking about not laughing, I don't know, they kind of set themselves up there a little bit, but yeah. It just watching people's kind of attitudes about it, it has been very frustrating, and very frustrating for the owners of the store, because it is a legitimate business. You know, we voted for it 60-40 here in Michigan to legalize marijuana. And when we have so many communities basically saying, not in my backyard. And I think it is kind of one of those things where if we sort of regularize it, that's not a word.
Normalize.
Normalize, thank you, Caitlin. And I don't mean like normalize it by like, you know, doing it or whatever, but normalize it by talking about it like it is a legitimate business, because it is. And and some of the smartest people I've ever talked to are in this business, and coming forward with trying to figure out these emission factors, and just the conversations that we have had with them, it blows my mind. I think it's the coolest thing. And honestly, like, my husband will be like, did you have your, you know, marijuana work group again today? Because he wants to hear about like what's going on with it, because it's interesting. And it's really awesome that, again, and I don't want to, you know, Caitlin's had to get so big it won't fit on her Zoom screen, but it has been really awesome to have someone be a leader on something like this and be part of something that's new and innovative, because in our groups, we talk so much about things that have existed for so long. This is just like, it's a really cool thing to be a part of. So I'm really glad that we were able to have this little chat, Donovan, too, and Mark. So thank you for making that happen.
Yeah, I totally agree on that. We've always appreciated Caitlin's readiness to share her information. I will also add on, it's like, while we've really focused on essentially processing from a CBD oil aspect, Hemp in general, cannabis in general, has about 50,000 potential uses. Whether it's being as fiber, being made into plastics, CBD is only or growing for smoking, oil process, whatever. That's just a minuscule amount of the potential for this plant. So as progress goes forward, some people may see more profit in these other industrial applications, and we need to be prepared for being flexible enough to look at them and be able to move forward on those, but treating them as just another type of process. It may be a new one, but it is a standard industrial process.
Well, and being the voice to help drive those other industries too, because here in Colorado, we legalized hemp in 2017, about a year before federal legalization. So we were only about one crop ahead. But even with 2 hemp harvests under our belt and legalization, we're seeing most of that end product. Most of the harvested hemp still go to the CBD market, and I think that that's just a bit of a bubble right now. I think that as more research comes out, it won't be this mystery cure-all. Certainly as the FDA starts regulating some of that messaging a little bit more tightly as well. But it's just all profit margin driven right now. I mean, you can get like 2,000% profit margins from taking raw hemp and converting it into oil. And so I hope that as markets level out and CBD trends kind of calm down, that we will start to see more industrial fiber applications, because this plant is a very sustainable source of fibers. I mean, if you look at the environmental footprint of hemp versus trees, for a lot of the similar applications, it's like percents less. It's a very low footprint. And so I'm excited to see more of that industrial market take hold.
Yeah, and in a general case, I think you can grow about 1,000 plants per acre for CBD, where you can get up to a concentration of 100,000 per acre for if you're growing purely for fiber.
Yes.
And I've actually been starting to see more people asking about plastics processing or other processing for hemp rather than looking at the CBD side, because I think the market may already be turning on that. I'm starting to see more people. There's a glut of hemp out there, especially here in the South, to the point where they don't have the processing capability for it, and it's potential that they may very soon be making a turn and start looking at other processes.
And it is important to point out too that the spent hemp fiber from extraction, so after post-extraction, you still have that plant material, that cannot be recycled for fiber recovery purposes, because the first step in extraction is to macerate that plant material, basically grind it almost into a dust, so that you get the most surface area contact with your solvent, so you get the most extraction efficiency out of it. And so that initial grinding process essentially destroys the fibers for secondary use.
All right, any final questions or thoughts? All right, hearing none, we certainly appreciate it. And if you have any questions, just email us, especially if you have any questions. Caitlin might be the resource that we would go to anyways. So thank you all, and you all take care, and we'll see you next time.